Very much. Matthias, I think we're ready to run for taping this.
Go.
And welcome to this is part of the learning stream of the Green Commodities program and Green the community of practice, and this particular learning stream on land use change monitoring. For this virtual workshop, what we have in mind is to talk about one specific experience, the experience of Costa Rica, because we wanted to zoom in one of the previous experiences that you saw on the first webinar. And as you might recall, in that first webinar, we visited different types of land use change monitoring systems, tools, web visors. We made some classification of terms, and it was just very introductory. And with this experience, we're calling it From Land Cover Change Monitoring to Deforestation-Free Commodities, because we wanted to give the opportunity to all the colleagues in this community of practice to learn a little bit about how we have attempted to go about this issue in Costa Rica, not only about the specifics of the land cover change monitoring that might be very technological centered, but on the whole strategic choices being made in Costa Rica. It's working in progress, so we wanted to give you sort of heads up of what's going on and give you an opportunity to interact with the key players in that system. One second. So the objectives that I've got for this session are basically to share lessons about one particular strategy to avoid deforestation associated with commodity production, a strategy for monitoring, but also the strategies related to institutional arrangements related to land use change monitoring systems. I want to describe how national or jurisdictional land use change monitoring system may be low cost and that it may be run locally. And we hope to explain how the strategy in Costa Rica provides the state with the opportunity of carrot and stick to ensure that forestry regulations are in place and there are incentives to pursue it, but also there are tools to make sure that people are compliant with this regulation, and also options of incentives and shutting of markets from the private sector by using this tool. And again, we want to emphasize the option that it's low cost for buyers and producers to have this tool that may be funded by the state. In terms of the agenda that I have, I want to achieve these objectives. I want to describe, obviously, what we're going to do is have a couple of slides where I'm explaining the whole model, explaining the whole system and the kind of products that are being generated, the assumptions that we have, the institutional arrangements that we have in place. Then we're going to open a question to Christian Vargas and maybe hopefully Cornelia as well about specifics on the technological aspects of the image processing being done in Costa Rica for these commodities and gain and loss of forest cover. Allow you participants to throw a question or two to the aspects and to that level of the conversation. Then we're going to jump into an explanation of the uses of MOCUP, of the system, how we call it here in Costa Rica, for private and public sector, allowing as well for some questions and answers to be addressed at that stage as well. And then finally, an explanation of the long-term sustainability, how we pursue this in the long term, how we plan to fund it, and the costs that we have in mind, the costs that we have incurred so far. And then finally, we just want to throw a question out there of what are the elements of MOCUP that may be replicable in your country, but more specific, how can this be useful in your context? And that's basically what we have in mind. So there will be 3 opportunities for all of us to interact. So it's not just me talking. Okay, so let me just start with an explanation of this is remembering everybody that we are all in the context of a community of practice linked to the Green Commodities program. And probably I'm just going to point to that phrase down there of the UNDP Green Commodities program, that we are all about multi-stakeholder processes for systemic change with the state for sustainable commodities. So one thing that we're known about is platforms, because we promote democratic dialogue to ensure that we pursue and address the externalities of commodity production. through multi-stakeholder processes. That's normally what most of this community of practice is all about, and all the methods and engagements with private sector and communication skills that we need to have. So one question that the audience of this learning stream might have is, to what extent, so what's the issue? Why is UNDP talking about something so technologically oriented? And the point is that this is why we wanted to make an emphasis on the experience of Costa Rica, because it stems out of a multi-stakeholder process of dialogue. It stems out of a platform. So in order for me to talk about MOCUP and the system of land use change monitoring, I need to start talking about the National Commodity Platform on Pineapple in Costa Rica. So I'm not going to talk about the explanation of Pineapple, of the platforms in general, but certainly say that we started with this dialogue in the year 2011 about all the main externalities of production. And we identified there are 5 main externalities of production. And again, I don't want to make this about Pineapple. I want to make this about our system to avoid deforestation using land use change monitoring. But from all those externalities of production, the process of thinking, one of them was obviously there was biodiversity loss because of forest cover removal, because of pineapple expansion. And the way the platforms work in this is that we pursue all the stakeholders in a commodity platform to think about first not only the problem, and in this case forest cover loss taking place in farms, but the causes of the problems. And that's the analysis, the root cause analysis that is part of the methodology of this community of practice in general, in order to address these processes with different stakeholders. When we think about the root cause, thinking about deforestation because of pineapple production in Costa Rica, we found out that one of the root causes of that was that there wasn't sufficient skills or tools by the government to make sure that there was enforcement of forestry law inside private farmland. We didn't have anything. The only way for the government to verify whether or not there was deforestation taking place was reactive, was after someone said there was some forest cover being lost because or eliminated because of a pineapple producer. And if there was evidence, then it would be prosecuted. So it was very based on reaction. So what the platforms dialogue did, we allowed us to move from this analysis of the root cause to convening these different stakeholders. And I'm going to talk of those stakeholders. We have the representatives of one of these, of the 3 most important elements of this land use change system, which is PRIAS, which is state universities, and a center of high technology created by the main state universities in the country that was convened and facilitated. And we convened, and UNDP convened the role and the skills and the mandate of PRIAS, which you will know about in a minute, with the skills and mandate of the National Geographic Institute and the skills and mandate of the National Institute that's responsible for managing property records in the country. And the solution is basically what we're about to show you. So MOCUP is basically a system that generates 3 types of information, and I mentioned this very quickly in the previous call, but I'm going to zoom into a type of information, and you can ask more technical questions with the participants in the call. First, the most important element, and I think that we start with that, is that we must have information on the commodity surface area, geopositioned information on commodity surface area. As you can see in the slide, we have the images of pineapple in the year 2000 and compared with pineapple growth in the year 2015. As you can see, it's a significant growth. And it's important because, again, this information is information that before MOCUP, we did not have on a yearly basis. The whole idea is that this kind of information is generated periodically. And I'm going to talk a lot about periodicity in this call because it's one of the principles that we have been pursuing in Costa Rica. We are underlining periodicity and ensuring that we have annual periodicity of the images of commodity surface area, and that's more important than having official information of the surface area. And I'm going to dive into that difference in a minute. So before we had this kind of information, the state basically had to rely mostly on agricultural census to have an idea of the position and the area and so total surface area of the specific commodities. We're supposed to have a census every 10 years, but really the last one we had was 30 years before. Again, so it's not very reliant information. It's not information that is very reliable either, because it comes from word of mouth from the producers. So basically what we found, for example, in the year 2015, is that in Costa Rica, the census was talking about 37,000 hectares of pineapple, when really the census for the country, the processing of satellite imagery allow us to tell us that there was 58,000 hectares of pineapple for a 12-month period difference. And of course, that's a significant amount of hectares that were not accounted for, that are not accounted for taxing, that are not accounting for the analysis of the impact of the production packages and the agrochemicals being used in the country, and that are not accounted for many sort of regulations. So obviously, this is one advantage of having commodity surface area on a yearly basis as one of the products being produced in Costa Rica, with the combination of the mandates and skills of these three entities. The second type of information being produced also by state universities, by PRIA's lab, by the people we have in the call, is gain and loss of forest cover associated with commodity expansion. So in those properties, in the production landscape where we have seen that pineapple growth in the previous slide, we found in black the areas of pineapple that did not cause forest cover loss, and in red, forest cover loss identified because of pineapple expansion. This information is very important. That it's, again, I'm going to underline why it's important to be for it in Costa Rica. The choice that we had is that it had to be done by state universities because they have a specific characteristic, and it is that state universities aim to publish. The most important element of a university is that they drive and they flourish publishing. Had we tried to generate the kind of information from official records by saying this layer that you're seeing now of forest cover loss, basically showing 5,666 hectares of a forest cover loss because of pineapple expansion, that's an information that is very controversial. It's very difficult, and that's the hypothesis in which we based our work. It is very difficult, or it's highly unlikely, that a Ministry of Environment or a Ministry of Agriculture will publish on a yearly basis information that is this controversial. And that's why, considering the drive of publication of universities, but also considering something that was mentioned by Christian Vargas earlier in a meeting this morning, considering the autonomies universities should have, it's another advantage of having them generating the data and not worrying about the data being official. We need to worry about using the data afterwards for official purpose, but it's not the data that needs to be generated by an entity that will have political reasons why not to publish. So again, this is information generated by PRIA's lab. The third type of information generated by MOCUP, which is basically the system to relate layers of information, is not generated by PRIAS. It's actually an official layer of information. But the strategy of MOCUP is basically to publish the two previous layers that you've seen, forest cover gain and loss associated with commodity expansion, and the specific commodity surface area that was generated by state universities, that is published on a web viewer that allows interaction with, yes, official layers of information. For example, and particularly useful, layers of information of property records. So if you can see the green line outside that that is marking that obvious forest cover loss because of pineapple, and what you see on the inside, what used to be forest cover, you see a pineapple expansion. And we can identify, because we relate those shapefiles on this web viewer that is owned by the National Geographic Institute of Costa Rica. And the work that UNDP did was to foster an alliance and an agreement between the state universities, where PRIA's lab is located, and the National Registry, where the National Geographic Institute is located. So they were allowed to publish this information. So again, all we're doing is linking. And that's the role that UNDP has been playing, fostering this, making sure that it is viable to generate this information on a yearly basis, getting the right people to do this information, and considering that, and making the right choices of who the right people it is that needs to be publishing this information. In Costa Rica, again, we thought it would be better to do it from the academia because they want to publish, and they will publish regardless of how controversial the information is. When we publish this information, and as you can see, it says it has a little sort of box open, and it says finca at the very bottom, that's farm. With this farm number, I am able to identify, go to another registry, another website, and identify, and I've crossed it out there, the name of the owner. The name of the owner of that property where there was a potential forest cover loss, which you have seen in the slides, or forest cover gain, because that's the beauty of the system. It allows us to use carrot and stick. It allows you to identify potential forest infringements and potential forest cover growth and link that to property. So the strategy in Costa Rica, we started doing that, and as I explained, based on a national commodity dialogue on the Pineapple, national platform of Pineapple, we created a national action plan, which included actions like generating a system like this to avoid deforestation because of pineapple production. But we realized that it was a very powerful tool. So now the system is running at a national level. So we're identifying the pineapple commodity surface area on a national scale, and the deforestation, or sorry, forest cover loss or gain associated to that particular commodity surface area. But we're doing it also, and we're starting now, and next year we're going to have the information for pasture without trees. So we are identifying the beef and the dairy production landscapes, and we're able to say the same kind of things about pineapple production units free of deforestation or free of forest cover loss. We will be able to say beef or dairy production units free of loss of forest cover. And the same we will be able to say about palm oil. We're basically have the funding already covered for the year, and up to the year 2021 for yearly monitoring of those three commodities. We expect to grow this system soon with sugarcane and bananas. We're just looking for the funding to do so, but obviously there's a lot of interest by the possibilities of really controlling and generating all kinds of uses for this. The theory, basically, and just to give you a little summary so far, is that we have three kinds of outputs. We're generating specific products. These are basically the surface area and the location of the export commodities that are the driver of deforestation or the driver of a lot of change in production landscapes at a national level. Again, Costa Rica is tiny. So if you're talking about the context of Asian countries, Indonesia, African countries, you might just basically translate all what I'm saying to just a jurisdictional approach of a province or a territory. But it's still, it's still very, very powerful because we have the technology now to make this cheap enough to allow us to go to that sort of jurisdictional level. So the one input is the surface area, location of exports, of export commodities, then the forest cover gain or loss analyzed within the production landscape. And we aim to do this by publishing it through an open access viewer that enables interaction with official layers, property records, water sources. And again, these are the outputs, and we just wanted to sort of share these outputs because we think the outputs may be different in different countries. In Costa Rica, we have this fantastic viewer, which is, it's not top of the notch, but it's very useful viewer, where you have of these official layers of information. In some countries, all you need to do is to make sure that you get information on a viewer. You might have the option of using MapX or using some of the web viewers that we were analyzing in the previous call to generate a system like this in your country. The kind of effects or the outcomes of this kind of inputs that we're generating is basically we want to ensure that we improve enforcement of forestry legislation. We want to make sure that producers are aware that they can be traced back in time and monitored for deforestation. I mean, we're looking back in Costa Rica at 15 years of forest cover loss because of commodity expansion. And we're looking at, to some extent, to prosecution in that and to basically make sure that people are aware that now it's easier to identify what happened in previous years. We want to make sure that we think that with a system in place like this on a national level will allow for new incentives to take place. Costa Rica is very well known for payment for ecosystem services. It's still limited in scope. This possibility of monitoring better how forest cover growth is taking place in some production sites will probably allow us to be better qualified or able to offer payment for ecosystem services to cattle ranchers and beef producers on their agroforestry systems, for instance. We think that this is going to lower the cost of certification or verification system of at least production units free of deforestation or with forest cover, with no forest cover loss, because we're aiming to basically justify to state entities and to reduce the costs by incorporating this into cooperation projects, but eventually incorporate it into the national budgets of governments, so that producers don't have to take on the lion's share of the cost of these new verification systems that are going to be out there now that the markets are saying that they want to only buy deforestation-free products. And hopefully we will be able to accelerate more buyers pledging to only purchase deforestation-free products. I mean, there's this big impetus and emphasis now on soy, on beef, on palm oil of big countries with big problems of deforestation, Paraguay, Indonesia, and so on. But issues like pineapple have not necessarily been so focused, or with other commodities it hasn't been so focused. This kind of system will allow for buyers to generate these kind of pledges for these kinds of crops as well. So that's a little bit more or less the theory that we have in mind of why we're generating the system as we have. And in order to explain further this system, we have always used a metaphor in Costa Rica, and we call it the three-legged stool in order to explain Mokup, because we need the basis of this, and is obviously what PRIA's lab can generate, what this independent remote sensor interpretation or independent teledetection service can provide. If it's not bound by political pressures, if it's aiming to publish, if it has autonomy, and it's reliable and peer-reviewed and scientific, then you have one element to generate the system, but you don't have all what it needs. You would need also a map viewer that allows users to openly and at an open access interact with the layers of information generated by state universities, but also with the layers of information from official sources, like property records, but also records of, for example, protected areas. Like we have found that there are pineapple being grown inside protected areas in Costa Rica by using the system. And finally, you want to make sure that it is easy for users like buyers to be able to click on the properties where potential deforestation or potential or forest cover loss took place. So they are able to identify, even with their own confidentiality agreements and logics inside the private sector. They don't necessarily need to share with the public sector who they are buying from. But if the information is there available, buyers will be able to make their own choices about purchasing policies, and they will be able to basically purchase without the reputational risk of buying from someone that generates deforestation. So it's important that the property records are growing at the same rate as the growth of the imagery. Now, it's very difficult for a country, and the countries that are, you're probably thinking of many countries where we're light years away from having the whole country with property records where you can have a click on. Even Costa Rica is not there yet, and we're probably a few years away from having the entire territory with areas that the property record is freely available through a click. However, the sequencing of the investment being done by the authority competent over property record, be that a municipality, be that a central government entity, needs to be coordinated so that more and more of those investments that are currently taking place, because the central banks and the ministries of finance are always interested in investing, ensuring that property records are kept in place and are managed. But normally, we are not talking with these kinds of entities. So again, the platform dialogues, the multi-stakeholder processes that we are leading from UNDP allow us to have land use change monitoring systems that are aligning these kinds of needed informations that allows us to have deforestation-free commodities. You need to be able to relate the information of forest cover loss with the information of commodity surface area, with the information of property records. And that's why we talk about the three-legged stool in order to explain the system. And the final word before I allow the people from Priya's lab to answer a question and to prompt some questions from the people in the audience now for this initial break is to explain a little bit more about this independent element. Again, we think state universities are very well located to generate this kind of information because they are scientific. That's what they thrive upon. They are peer review and are reliable. They will have their methodology exposed and they will thrive with their methodology being discussed and analyzed. They will want to publish regarding of how controversial information may be. And again, state universities can be, and again, this is part of the skill of aligning with universities, can be low cost. And in a moment, I'm going to be very transparent about the investments we've done in Costa Rica to be where we are now. But again, it's in a university that is not for profit, but for building capabilities in a country where we can generate kind of the skills that we need. So now I'm going to, Matthias, please allow me unmute Christian and Cornelia. So they can, in order to prompt them, I'm sure people may be asking one interesting question that I want to raise to you. I think there's two questions that I want to start the people, and I'm going to start with these two questions so you can answer. And then in the meantime, people can think of any more questions that they want to ask you. And we can go with like a 5-minute round of this. But the two questions I have are, one, what is the verification method and what is your method? A little bit, if you want to explain in 2 minutes the method that you have of advanced classification, and how is it that you generate this imagery? Because I've only talked of the strategy here. That would be first question. And the second question, I think it's very important that a lot of people will ask Costa Rica when they see this, is that why do you bother doing forest cover analysis when in Costa Rica, if there is such a thing like a tool out there like Global Forest Watch? Why didn't you just use that and then concentrate only on commodity sectors? And I think it's a common question that I get that I think might be on the heads of the people here, because people will know about Global Forest Watch. So I'll let you two respond and let any other people make any other questions. So please go ahead.
Okay. The idea with the methodology in the field, it's basically to use the Landsat and Sentinel images, and we process the information to extract the different commodities using the different algorithms like a maximum likelihood and decision tree. And with this information, we can build the different polygons to putting in the SNIT. And for the other questions, In the case of the analysis for the forest loss, the importance is we have a specific places or polygons to analyze with the specific information. And it's different with you use the information from Global Forest Watch. Why? Because the Global Forest Watch use a pixel size like at 30 meters. In our case, we found the deforestation or the loss forest in a small areas. So that's why it's in the case of Costa Rica, our methodology and why we use this method.
Okay, thank you. So just to summarize, it seems that it makes sense in that case, in the explanation of why Global Forest Watch is very useful in big patches to identify big patches of forest. When we're analyzing forest cover loss in pineapple, we're talking of things that are 2 hectares inside and things like that. So it's better aimed at the kind of forest loss that we're aiming. So that's an explanation of tailoring the land use change monitoring systems to the kind of forest enforcement that we want in the country. Anything else from your side, Christian or Cornelia, or should I allow any questions that you have? Cornelia, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to tell everyone that no system substitutes the other. They go like it actually potentiates one each other. So with Global Forest Watch, you can have an overview of everything of what's going on in a big panorama, but with Mokup, you can have a specific view of what is going on in the territory in Costa Rica, you know, in a specific area. So that's something you can play with, and the buyers can start to interpret regarding of their interests.
Okay. Anyone else wants to make a question on technical aspects or anything in general, what you heard so far?
I have questions from peers, but does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, this is Leo from MapHubs. I'd just be curious if there is a good paper that someone could recommend that has a comparative framework describing the different types of monitoring tools. So looking at Global Forest Watch, which people talk about Global Forest Watch, but really you're talking about GLAD UMD. I mean, that's really the research institution behind the pixels available to Global Forest Watch. And of course, there's Former, which is available as well, but is much lower resolution. But can anyone recommend a paper which has a good comparison of methodologies? That would be quite helpful for me, certainly, maybe others as well.
Well, Leo, it's a fantastic question, because to be honest, I think the UN Red team, and maybe Bruno can help me. I know you guys started I saw something very on draft format, but eventually I think it's you're pointing out to a good publication that we should be pursuing. So the answer is, to the best of my knowledge, no.
No. Yeah, I just want to alter that. No, I don't know such a publication, but I think everybody needs it. And it's a good idea to start thinking about it. And remember that the 19% of the information of the world has been has been constructed in the last 2 or 3 years. So it's like a really small period of time. And now finding good information is like finding your needle in the hay. Mm-hmm. So I think we need more people, you know, or someone, maybe, you know, someone with a master's degree or something to sort out all these different information platforms and write this paper, because it will be really useful.
But considering your two comments, and I think Matthias and I are taking note of this, and I think, because one question I had in mind is, where do we go configure? Because I can really zoom into Costa Rica, and then that's what we're doing in this call. But later, maybe this learning stream, we need to do more of this comparative analysis, and maybe this community of practice can be the source of which ones should we prioritize, and how to construct the right analysis, because we need to differentiate between just web viewers and actual monitoring tools, actual methods, that kind of thing. So I think you're pointing on an interesting note, but I don't want to deviate too much the call on this. We take note, and probably we take it into the future of this community of practice. A very, very good point, Leo. Anyone else with a specific question?
I will go with Pierre's questions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one related to, it says, if land has the status of agricultural land by the state, why is it a problem to deforest? And if the land is inside a community producing area, what is the problem of forest cover laws?
Well, it's a logical question, and since 1996, forest cover loss is illegal in Costa Rica, regardless of the property regimen. So basically, you're not allowed to chop down anything that looks more than 2 hectares, 2 square hectares. I'm simplifying the law, but as you cannot chop anything that looks more than 2 square hectares of forest cover. Even if it's private land and marked as agricultural land. Not only that, and this is why it's very important to have this tool, because it allows us to monitor that, which is just automatically considered deforestation. But then it also allows us to monitor specific agricultural regulations, like, for example, the distance that you need to have from riverine forest cover, and specific protection areas within plantations, and that's the beauty of it, when we are able to tweak and turn it. And that's basically what you can see on the slide that we have in front of us. That's basically 2 different interpretations, or 2 different forms of the new water law in Costa Rica. On the right hand side, you see the way the forest cover needs to be maintained in a previous version of the water law in Costa Rica, in order to protect water catchment areas. And in the other, you have the previous definition of the law of water, of protection of water recharge areas. And basically what MOCUP would do is, if it identifies a water catchment area using an official layer of information, then it would have to identify whether, depending on which of the 2 options of the law are passed, which is currently being discussed in the National Assembly, how to analyze those kinds of points. So that's why it's good to have local interpretation and systems that are designed for forest cover law compliance, that are tailored to the specific law. And that's why it's important also to have governance and to have it done locally, because maybe in Costa Rica, it's, as I explained, this is completely illegal. In another country, it's completely legal. So it's not necessary to have that fine analysis of a small plots of land. So it's a very good question. Any other?
Yeah, I have another one from Pierce. Is pineapple expansion a driver of deforestation in the country? And if not, is forest cover loss also being assessed with other community? I think other commodities. I think you addressed this question already.
Yes, but it's important element angle that I want to say. Yeah, it's indirectly a driver. That's why we are analyzing pasture, because the way it works is that first you chop down the forest, you get some cattle in there. After your cattle, you're a claim property or land, or you are owner of the land, which is cheaper basically to chop down forest and get some cattle. And then it takes a lot of time to get your money, or to have an engagement to be able to use the land for pineapple, because you need an investment of at least $12,000 per hectare to generate a profit of 20,000. So the initial driver, it's always the cow is always the driver. Is the frontier maker. But indirectly, pineapple is a driver. And yes, we're analyzing with other commodities. Basically, we're aiming to do this. We have developed this to be low cost, so it may be replicable. So it's easier to do it with crops that are easier to analyze with a remote sensor. That it's free or cheaper. Obviously, it's easier to analyze pineapple, which is a bromeliad. It's very distinct from forest cover. It would be harder and much more expensive, or maybe trickier to do or impossible to do agroforestry analysis as well, or this kind of analysis in a coffee landscape under shade, for instance. Any more?
Yeah, we have another one. With the work that you are doing on the mapping, who are some of the groups that see you as a threat?
Okay, everybody. Okay, so the first people that saw us as a threat were the pineapple producers. But there's an interesting anecdote, and I want to go try to do it very quickly. Basically, after this information was published, and the beauty of it is that Christian and Cornelia will publish it regardless of what a Minister of Environment or Agriculture will say. So before I got the calls from the Minister of Environment, and I can go into that in a while, we got the call from the Chamber of Exporters of Pineapple, and they were saying, we want to convene UNDP, we want to know about this, what's this all about? And we had the whole board, and I think Cornelia was in that meeting, and the whole board of CANAPEP was there. They were underlined every single document that we've produced about the Mocup. They had read it all, and they were just ready to kill us, basically. When they were pointing out, it's like, oh, so now the environmentalists are throwing rocks at us and saying that we just chopped down so many forests. And our answer was very good and basically changed the mood of that meeting. And it was basically, yes, that's true. That's information that it came out from the system. But have you told the environmentalist groups how much forest cover pineapple producers actually keep today? There was a quiet in the room, and the response is, no, I don't know. And it's with exactly this tool, the one that you are able to tell the same amount of information. The tool is not bad, it's not good, it's just objective information. And it allows the link of the property record to tell the story that you need to tell, in the sense that if you have done well your deeds. Hopefully in Costa Rica, many of these pineapple producers also own a lot of land, and basically now they can value the information being generated by this in terms of the forest cover that they are keeping. And this is the argument with which we're going to the beef producers. They are not seeing us as a threat because they used to be the main drivers of deforestation in the country. A lot of them, and the system has changed a bit now, and they're not as extensive. But basically, they see us as an opportunity to show to the world that they're keeping a lot of forest. So those are the first ones that saw us as an enemy, and there was a nice switch to that. So basically, the message here is that we need to explain this as a system of basically carrots and sticks, and you can generate information that can show the forest cover gain, but also show the forest cover loss. And that's what's going to be valuable out in the markets. More questions, please.
That was all from
okay.
Peter.
Thank you.
He says thank you. Okay,
lovely. So I'll continue a little bit with this explanation. So I've only explained so far, and with this intervention by Cornelia and Kristen, thank you very much. We've explained one of those three legs of the stool. The second, again, is this issue of the authority competent over property records. I think I covered this very quickly. All I want to mention is that no country will have all the property records online in a map, none. And we're not saying that in order to replicate the system, you need to have all your property records. In fact, you don't need to have the property records, because in order to generate incentives or disincentives from the markets, because a large buyer of a commodity will have or will look for the information, or will request whoever is providing sourcing them, the information of the position from where they're producing. So they will have in their own confidentiality their information about where they are sourcing from. If you make available information of the commodity surface area and gain and loss of forest cover, they will be able to use that and use it with their own records. If you're in a country that it's able to, as well as that, generate the property records, even better, because it allows you to have more transparency. All we're saying about this is that authorities with developing these property records exist in every single country, and in most of these countries they are working completely outside of the scope of people working on environment and people working on deforestation or commodity supply chains. And we need to include them in the conversation, and we need to sequence their funding and their investments. This morning we had a conversation in Costa Rica where the people from the National Authority of Property Records are giving us a great information that in 4 years' time we're going to have almost the entire country completely managed. The priority of that area, what county will come first and second, will be key if we are able, the ones working on deforestation-free supply chains, to tell them, please prioritize these counties or these areas or these properties and this mapping in this area where we are having this analysis of deforestation. That's all we're saying about this alignment with authorities competent over property records. Finally, again, the uses of Mokupa, and I want to emphasize, this is useful for the public sector because you are able to enforce forestry law. Every year that a Ministry of Environment needs to pursue who has not complied with forestry law, they don't need to wait until someone sees someone chopping down a forest in a pineapple production landscape. They will have every year the information on a map, and they will be able to it's an alert. It's not official information. It's not automatic prosecution for those red bits of map that you saw earlier. It's an alert that the state needs to act upon. So it will allow them to act on a punitive sense, but also on an incentive sense. What about the areas where you are finding forest cover gain? Well, you want to tell that story, and you want to generate even more incentives to increase forest cover gain. And I'm talking of a country that used to be that it had the highest rate of deforestation in the 1980s. We only had 21% of forest cover, and now Costa Rica has 52% of forest cover, and we have basically surpassed the problem of deforestation, and we have increased forest cover. So, and we're aiming for 60%. So the story can be done, and the story is based on two things: on prohibition of forest cover, a loss, but also on the generating of incentives. So that's why the picture of the carrot and the sticks. For the public sector, this system allows to be able to do that. And we are really aiming for countries through these national dialogues, through the national platforms, to develop and to design systems that are able to generate, that are able to be used as a carrot and the stick by the public sector. Same with the private sector. If you are a decision maker, you want to get rid of the purchasing of the risk of purchasing from someone who has is going to generate you a link to deforestation. So you avoid that purchasing, and you want to make sure that you're generating purchasing from people who can tell a nice story of your product. So, for example, beef that has forest cover on the land that is being produced, or that is not causing deforestation, or the same for pineapple, or the same for palm oil. The use of the buyers, and I'm going to extend, just jump into a little bit more of the uses that we're looking into in Costa Rica. It's not only just to tell this, inform this decision making about purchasing or not purchasing, or purchasing with a premium or not purchasing with a premium, but it's also important to compensate. So, for example, I'm going to give an example. I'm not going to mention a company, but an important European company purchasing pineapples from Costa Rica has already, using the system, identified quite a lot of hectares of forest cover that were lost in the past 15 years from people that have been providing pineapple to them in the past 15 years. So it's highly likely that they have been purchasing pineapple with linked to forest cover loss. So basically, by using this system and linking another layer that I haven't talked about, which is, for example, or that I mentioned very briefly before, for example, water catchment areas and water sources, what we have identified is the total number of hectares of forest cover that were lost by those people sourcing this big company, and basically identifying the area of compensation where we would need to have reforestation and restoration of the ecosystem in an area of important water recharge, which will be funded by the sources of that pineapple and by the buyer of this pineapple. So again, in order to compensate and to restore that landscape that has been damaged for pineapple. So this is not only a tool that will avoid deforestation, but a tool that in some way can restore back and compensate some of the loss that has been done. And thanks to the fact that we've had satellites for a long time now, we can go back in time and try to do this. We can go back in time in Costa Rica because the law that I talk about is from 1996. So basically all of the imagery and all of the mishaps can be processed legally, and we can also continue to generate incentives. Finally, in terms of the producers, one of the elements of work that we're trying to generate in Costa Rica is producing a verification system for deforestation-free production units. So because we have the system in place, we're basically aiming to pursue it and to generate a very straightforward system that will allow producers at no cost or very little cost to show on a year after year that their production units are free of deforestation. And then they will be in a better position to differentiate their product, particularly now that there are more and more pledges of deforestation-free commodity supply chains. Please excuse my cat sounding around here. And obviously, we are aiming this right now. Let me just go into... Okay, let me just go into public sector enforcement challenges. And I'm keeping this to the very end because it was part of one of the questions being raised about who has seen this as a threat. So the immediate response I made was, well, the private sector and the exporters, which now they don't see us as a threat. But it's now we're working hard to win over the public sector for them to use it, because there's many things that haven't been resolved. For example, to what extent this is automatic evidence that can be used in a court of law. It's still relevant information that we need to, we're testing it. So far, we have identified people that have caused deforestation in the past 15 years. We have identified the properties, and we're still in the process of the inspections. And there is a lot of hesitance by the entities within the Ministry of Environment trying to do this. So a lot of the work that we are doing now is building the trust for the system. Again, we have aimed and we have decided not to do it inside these institutions for the reasons I mentioned before, but that doesn't mean that we don't want these institutions to use it. We are generating, to some extent, the pressure, to other extents, the trust building, to other extent, the knowledge, many different strategies that allows us to move away from just a slow adoption. And again, the epicenter of that slow response by the government is that it's very difficult to sell the idea that I mentioned in the beginning. We do not think that we need these layers of information to be official. We think the layers of information need to be reliable, they need to be scientific, they need to be peer-reviewed, and they need to have a governance that is close to the country. So if there's any mistake, it can be corrected quickly. And if there is some misinformation, it can be managed properly. But it needs to be autonomous and it needs to be independent. And it needs to publish regardless of how controversial the data may be. So that goes against the logic that normal state entities have and people working in the state institutions that would want to build their GIS departments inside their ministries and think that that's the way to go. And again, this is all about Agenda 2030 and the issue. We need to work outside of silos, and we need to rely on the skills and the mandates of the institutions all of the countries that we're working in have. And that's really one of the biggest challenges, that entails communications, that entails capacity and trust building and connecting people. With the biggest aim of this is, the aim is not for me to have a thriving department of GIS experts in my department if I'm going to have a minister above me that's not going to allow me to publish. The aim of this is to avoid deforestation from commodity supply chains. So that's a little bit of the process in which we're in. Had this been the call in the morning in Spanish, you probably would have here a member of Parliament of Costa Rica, a former member of Parliament, explaining the work that she's doing in trying to generate these interinstitutional arrangements. It's a long-term process. We have been grinding this in a project, and we think countries that want to go this way and want to adopt these processes need to think of this as a long-term process. Again, like platforms, it's not going to be from the morning to the day after you're going to have a system in place. We didn't expect it to happen for all the commodities, and obviously it all depends on the size of the area that you need to monitor. Finally, in terms of long-term sustainability, basically, I mentioned this, we already covered pineapple pasture palm oil up to year 2022. We've included this in a UNDP GEF project, a Global Environmental Facility project, and we're basically investing for all those commodities for all of those years into year 2016, $1 million. Again, that's not the cost of the imagery per se, because we are building the capacity of PRIA's lab, because we are interested in investing in PRIA's and investing on state universities and in this autonomy in the long term. But the expectancy is not for this to be international cooperation money. We have only 4 years until the year 2022 to make sure this is adopted by a country that is very progressive on conservation issues, but it's in the middle of a fiscal crisis. So it's still an uphill struggle, and we're still trying to basically, what we're aiming is to show that this is going to generate a lot of cost reduction for different institutions, cost reductions for the Ministry of Agriculture, of Environment, of Finance, of municipalities, of the National Statistics and Census Institute. So many uses for having this information on a yearly basis that will reduce the cost of the state. And ideally will reduce the cost of producers and buyers to make sure that commodities are free of supply chains. So in terms of the investments, this is the cost that we have, $1 million from the year 2016 to 2020, building the capacity of one institution. We had an initial investment by targeted support from RED, 100,000, and the initial pilot, also a link UN RED and the Green Commodities Program. Through the Green Commodities Program, again, we facilitated the process that thought about this process in the very beginning. The costs are relative. Costa Rica is a very small country, but this is done at a national scale. And again, we think this is the most cost-effective option to have a national system in place that is tailored for avoiding forest cover loss and for incentivizing increased forest cover in production landscapes. Finally, just a quick image of other uses that we have. Of course, when we relate the information of commodities with other information, like for example, of water resources, we can identify, for example, all the rural aqueducts that have high risk of contamination from agrochemicals because they are close to plantations or completely surrounded by plantations, and because of gradients, we're able to see that the flows would go directly into the aqueducts of the cities. So again, I just basically wanted to show this slide to explain the different uses that go just beyond deforestation, and that's why it's important to have the three elements: the properties, commodity surface area, and the forest cover loss and gain. Okay, so I'm finalizing now. Just going to give you guys a chance to speak up on a final question. But basically, the lessons that we learned so far is that it's important to have an emphasis on periodical publication of commodity surface area and gain and loss of forest cover associated with that agricultural production. And we think we need to emphasize more on periodicity, so allows for monitoring rather than officiality. Second, we want to basically emphasize the importance of having independent teledetection experts and low-cost arrangements for that annual periodicity. we want to emphasize that the publication of layers needs to be done through open access viewers that allow the interaction with other official information. It doesn't necessarily need to be a state-run viewer. If you are able to relate these official layers of information through other private viewers, that's perfectly fine. We just need to have the information out there. If it's out there, it's very difficult for prosecution not to happen and for the private sector not to take, not to use it. National processing of the imagery, and especially the one that's very controversial, by independent entities, allows for local correction and local governance and interaction and tailoring of these kinds of systems. And finally, we need to have sustainability, financial sustainability strategies for these systems. They should not be dependent on international cooperation arrangements, and they should be funded as much as possible by the state and by local users as well. So that's basically all we had for today. And the last bit that we wanted to request to you, as my cat is meowing here, is what do you find most useful of this case study for your context? We would love to hear that. Not everybody needs to speak. Maybe you can all just want to shut away. But I would like to find out if any of this is something that you think may be replicable. So please open the mic for anyone who wants to share their thoughts.
Jordan, would you like to ask your questions?
No?
Jordan from PNG.
Yeah, it's good. Kiefer, the presentation is much technical, but it's good. It's good to learn more about the type of land use cover mechanisms been used in Costa Rica. But I'm just one question: if how is the political sustainability of the platform there in Costa Rica? Because I think here in Papua New Guinea, we have, election stuff, and if we have these things in place, then we have, during the elections, and our members or our politicians who are currently supporting these things and are out of the line, then there is no political sustainability of what we're currently doing, right? So, yeah, I'm just wondering if what's the political sustainability there in Costa Rica, especially supporting?
Well, it's a process of building it up. I mean, the idea is, as you probably tell, it was very revolutionary when we thought about it. It was very controversial. It's still very controversial. I think we need to build the process and sell the idea that you need to have that you need periodicity. And this is important. I mean, I think you're in PNG, you're in an early stage in the dialogue process. And it's important for someone like a practitioner like you to have in your radar these kind of experiences, and that it's viable and logical to push the agenda for independent teledetection. Obviously, it's not very politically sensible to start a conversation with the Ministry of Agriculture and say, I know you will never publish this information, so I'm going to take it away from you. Obviously, we need to find ways to communicate and to be politically sensitive in how to do this. So I think our task is to be aware of the advantages of independent teledetection and basically pursue that. And an arrangement with the university is not something that is necessarily frowned upon, because it can just be mentioned, and it's normally it sounds very innocuous that you're saying, oh, we want to explore with the university, which is what we did. We want to explore with the university a pilot about to what extent this can be done low cost. That's an initial induction to the topic, and that's the first exploration we did in the topic. And it was completely innocuous for all the government entities that we talked about. And then we continued, and then it was just basically UNDP continued working with that university, and we realized that it would be good if that university was able to publish those fundings through a website that could relate that information with other layers of information. So we worked on that, and that was just a bilateral work between the UNDP and that state universities and the National Geographic Institute. So it wasn't necessarily an issue of like I needed to ask for permission from this or that minister to do that. It was basically an innocuous inclusion in the National Action Plan, which was approved. So I had a mandate to be able to do this, and then once there was an agreement between the state universities that they could be publishing on this web viewer, it was only a matter of generating or mobilizing resources to fund this periodicity of information. And then we were able in Costa Rica to convince the Ministry of Environment to include this into a GEF project. So it was a process of convincing. I'm being very blunt here to try to capture in this call in an hour, but we're extending a little bit more, all of the lessons that we had. So I'm sounding non-diplomatic and non-political. But that's really the messaging is what I want to put across. It's really independent teledetection, what we're aiming for, because of obvious reasons, and it's a piloting process. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, great. Now I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kiva.
Okay. Any more comments about what you find useful of the case study or questions in general?
Yeah, this is Bruno here. Actually, it's to continue on this question of independent monitoring, because as part of RED Plus, we've been developing, and it was mandatory for the countries wanting to participate in the RED Plus mechanism. We've been supporting, and it's more a partner, FAO, who's been supporting the establishment of national forest monitoring system, so satellite based and everything. And the question that I have, and the issue that I have with a lot of colleagues, my boss, with a lot of people, is basically every time we're talking about independent remote sensing monitoring, is and the donors as well, why are you thinking about trying to develop a parallel system? You're just multiplying systems, it's not sustainable and whatever. But not understanding that actually it has very different objectives, and that, as you said, the problem is, for example, if we're talking about the National Forest Monitoring System as part of RED Plus, it's usually within one ministry, and even more than one ministry. It's actually very often controlled by one department, and where actually there is very little incentives and very little motivation from those actors to actually share the information and ensure bridges with other ministries, other actors, and making sure that actually the web platform is an area where it's possible to mutualize information. And to me, that's really a major barrier to using that system for what we're discussing right now. We need to make sure that actually it's a system where multiple actors can actually contribute information to actually enrich it. And
absolutely.
From what I've seen around the world, it doesn't happen when it's actually one department within one ministry that controls everything, and it's really jealous of its prerogative.
No, absolutely. And the thing is, and what Ski is saying is, we need to generate those systems. This is not, Mocup is not substituting all of the RED arrangements that we have in Costa Rica that have all those characteristics that you mentioned. So the forest monitoring is done by the National Protected Area System, and they're doing that, and it's published, and that's another layer. Fine, that's an official layer, that's fine. And they're monitoring in Costa Rica, in the case of Costa Rica, what they're monitoring is mostly what's happening inside protected areas. Here, we're analyzing the interaction of the commodity with forestry law. And we're generating this from someone who only has the skill to interpret remote sensors. It doesn't have the pressure to make sure there is less or more of that in non-compliance with the forestry law, which is that same department will have that pressure. So you'll have people thinking this is going to generate more work or more trouble or someone wanting to shoot me or something like that. So it's important. It's complementary in the arrangement in Costa Rica, and that's why I mentioned and I showed that explanation that it was funded also by UN-RED. This is part of UN-RED products in Costa Rica too, and as UN-RED is supporting the forestry monitoring for the convention and all of that, this is also part of the RED strategy because it's a complementary element. And for me, is the element that is closer to avoiding deforestation. The other elements of the most formal RED mechanisms will be very good to put a price on carbon and to report to UNFCCC and that kind of thing. And we need that. But this is an additional and can be low cost. And
totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree, and I think that there is a lot more awareness raising to do on that, including to the donors, including to the governments and the partners, and within our teams as well. But I definitely get it. Another thing to get back to the question that Leo had earlier, I can see actually a multiplication of over the last few years, as you said. There's been really a multiplication of remote sensing web platforms. You were mentioning about Global Forest Watch, and everybody tend to be focused on it because it was probably some of the first one to make it globally freely available and so on. Doesn't make them necessarily the best. But people tend to be focused on that. But actually, there are more and more different platforms, web platforms that actually provide different services. So I don't know, MapHubs is one example. There was Mapix. We discussed it before on a different webinar. There was SIAT with TerraEye, and so on and so on. Very often, we slightly there was FlexiWatch now starting. I think. Again, more and more emerging, benefiting from that democratization of remote sensing. Very often with slightly different objectives and orientations. But as Leo said, it would be very, very interesting to have a bit of a comparative analysis between all those different platforms, services, and whatever, what they do, what they're good at, what they're not good at, because again, they can complement one another, how much they cost. And again, it's not because it's controlled by an NGO that it will be cheaper than a more kind of private service. Some of the big NGOs are very, very expensive. Again, but then if it's just about everybody presenting why its own web platform is the best, then we don't necessarily see what are the cons as well, the negative points, or because everybody wants to actually focus on the good things. So it would be really, really, really good if we could have that sort of independent analysis, a benchmark, to explain again, as I've seen for some other applications, see what web service is good for what. And that would really help in orienting partners and countries and whatever towards what the most adapted to what they want to do and the condition they have in their country. Because again, capacity in Costa Rica is very far from capacity in I don't know, Central Africa or other things. So it would be really, really useful, I think, to have that. But we need a bit of time and money to do that work before we discuss it in a webinar or something.
And absolutely, but what's good of the webinar is that it's pointing, it's giving us a task. I'm not taking the task only as the Green Commodities Program, but certainly something that I think we can discuss generally as UN-RED, because you guys have a fantastic team of experts who could really provide the brain power to do a decent comparative analysis and eventually go to a webinar and discuss it. But yeah, absolutely. Any more comments or questions? No? Well, in that case,
I will. Sorry, Cliff. Then if you don't mind, then I will take the mic a little bit more. Just one quick question. Actually, with the and sorry if I missed that in the presentation, but over the last few years, a big thing as well, a big new thing was actually the Sentinel, the Copernicus program from the EU, and then Sentinel images with both radar and multispectral images. I was wondering whether you make use of that in your system in the case of Costa Rica, because I've been seeing recently some publication that were showing that even though it's not very high level resolution imagery as some other rapid eye or whatever, that actually because it's so multispectral and radar at the same time, actually some researchers have been able to do some really interesting work even in complex environment in Myanmar, using that kind of satellite imagery, which is completely free, which is actually periodic every 16 days and so on.
I think so, but the adequate person to answer that is Christian or Cornelia.
Yeah, Bruno. Actually, in the shapefile from 2016, we used to Sentinel-2. For this year, we are using again Sentinel-2 combined with Landsat 8 to generate the shapefile from the pineapple. So we are doing the we are using the Sentinel, yeah, in this moment.
Okay, great. And do you know if Global Forest Watch is available on it as well or not?
I don't know. I don't know. I have to check.
Okay.
Thank you, and well done for the great work. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Any last comments before we let you start your day or stop your day? Or
I want to make one comment regarding Sentinel and Landsat. Sentinel has more better resolution than Landsat, but still they are in the medium range satellite precision data, and this is because you want to have like an idea of what's going on in the territory. But if you want to do it a better study or more profound study, you have to contract someone. So this is a generation or dynamizer of the economy, as I call it. And they don't want to do it like really high resolution, because then if you want to process the whole country, it will be like so much work, and there are areas that people won't be interested in doing like a high precision data. So it's better to give it to like the company or the owner or the researcher that wants to do a specific study, high resolution data.
okay. Any last pressing comment before I close this webinar? No? Well, thank you all very much for this hour and a half with us. Very useful comments, very useful questions, interesting conclusion about the need of a comparative analysis, a lot for us to point down and reflect upon, and hopefully this was useful for those of you who are live and those who are just listening after this happened. I hope you were able to learn a little bit about an experience, and hopefully this will help you reflect and plan better your work on land use change monitoring to avoid deforestation from commodity supply chains in your own country. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Kifa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.